Hello, Harlem Renaissance students. I'm going to give you a little bit of notes and commentary on chapters 10 through 17 of Their Eyes Were Watching God, just to highlight a few things and maybe pose some questions for you to think about. So, first of all, this is where Tea Cake has now entered Janie's life, and we see these pretty extreme contrasts between how Joe treated her and how Tea Cake treats her. And Tea Cake's a pretty complex character, and certainly making an argument about the impact he has on Janie's life, to what degree he's an improvement over Joe and Logan Killix, could be something some of you might want to address in a paper for a final project. But a few things I want to point out. Notice that the very first things Tea Cake and Janie do together are laugh and play. And play is something that Janie really wanted. The whole time she was married to Joe, she loved hearing and laughing at the stories people would tell on the porch of the store. But Joe explicitly forbid her from participating and didn't want her to play checkers. And she even tells Tea Cake, Joe said my brain wasn't good enough for checkers. So notice that Tea Cake comes in and he brings a lot of play into her life. And I'm going to consult my notes here real quickly. Notice when she starts to think about going off with him, the townspeople are very gossipy and very judgmental, and partly they're worried about her, that they think Tea Cake might be after her for her money. Partly they're worried because they all have somebody in town that they think she should marry and pass the money along to. So some of it is gossipy and selfish. Some of it might be real concern for Janie. There's a conversation between Janie and Phoebe about how, she tried things her grandmother's way and she didn't like them. And her grandmother's concern with protecting Janie's economic safety was really motivated by and driven by the grandmother's experience with slavery. So something to keep in mind as we think about the criticism this book received for not explicitly addressing issues of racism and oppression. Keep in mind that we do see from Janie that she knows much of her life was dictated by the ongoing effects of slavery from back her grandmother's generation. As Tea Cake decides to take Janie off on down to the muck, that's the reference to the Everglades part of Florida where it's sort of swampish. So he has experience down there and wants to go down and participate in the planting and harvesting season. They end up staying there for a whole year and then partly into the next. And I'm going to pose some questions on the forum about what you think of the things Tea Cake does that are a little bit less positive, like when he takes off with the $200 Janie had hidden in her blouse. And his explanation is that he wanted to see what it felt like to throw a big party for people. And when Janie's upset that he didn't invite her to that party that her money was paying for, he says, well, but these people are common. You're too good for them. I didn't want you to see me around those kinds of people. And then he also seems to have sort of wanted to get rid of that money so that he could know that Janie was dependent on him and that whatever they had together. So Janie seems to accept that. I will be curious to see what you think of whether that brings Tea Cake down in your estimation at all, or whether you accept that as just one person's way of trying to strengthen that bond between him and Janie. He does win the money back by putting himself in a dangerous situation with gambling where he gets hurt. But he tells her also, okay, I got all your money back. Put it with your other money in the bank. You can depend on me while you're with me. So I'll ask you to think about and react to what you think about Tea Cake's actions there. Then some of the other complex things come up when he asks Janie to go out and work with him in the fields. On the one hand, Janie is happy to do that. She didn't like being, as they say, classed off from her fellow black people in the town of Eatonville. So in a way, it's a good thing, but it's also not something she's used to. She hasn't had to work in fields before, but she says she enjoys it. So he asks her to go in the field. And I want to point out there's a couple of different ways that ongoing metaphor of the tree and that motif of trees and blossoms comes in. Notice, for example, early in her time of sort of starting to fall in love with Tea Cake, the narration says on page 106 that he could be a bee to a blossom, a pear tree blossom in the spring. He seemed to be crushing scent out of the world with his footsteps. crushing aromatic herbs with every step he took. Spices hung about him. He was a glance from God. So we see she's really falling for him. And again, we can tell that because he could be a bee to her blossom. But then once they're out down on the muck and she's out working in the fields with him, when she starts to get jealous, that also is portrayed with the motif of the tree. At the very beginning of chapter 15, we get a statement that a seed begins to grow in her, and that it might grow into a tree of doubt. So the tree metaphor comes in again. Notice the contrast between the way that they fight physically in chapter 15 versus chapter 17. Chapter 15, when she attacks him because she's jealous about Nunki and he denies anything happened there, and he just holds her wrist and doesn't hit her back and tries to keep her from hurting him. That's quite different from what happens in chapter 17. Also notice in chapter 17 when we do see this bit of violence come from Tea Cake, it's as a response to the colorism of Mrs. Turner. It's as a response to Mrs. Turner working so hard to make Janie judge Tea Cake negatively just because he's darker skinned. So Mrs. Turner makes a lot of comments about what she calls Negro people or black people, and what she calls yeller. It's spelled like yeller, but means yellow or lighter skinned people. And Mrs. Turner has this really strong idea that it's better to be lighter skinned, it's better to have straighter hair. And she uses this as a way to try to get Janie to leave Tea Cake and marry her own brother who has straight hair. So she views him as better somehow. And she views herself as more on Janie's level because, again, Janie has that long hair that is a little bit straighter and Janie is a little bit lighter complected. So Mrs. Turner thinks the two of them are somehow more on the same level because of the lighter skin. So again, the book had some criticism from people like Richard Wright and others who said it didn't directly address racism, but the root of colorism is also white supremacy, and we see colorism having a pretty intense impact here, especially when Tea Cake's response to that is to finally go ahead and hit Janie. Not because he was angry with her, but as a way to show to Mrs. Turner and to the other people down there on the muck that he's in charge, that he does view her as somewhat of a possession at that point. So that's one of the really important things about this segment of the book is the way that colorism, which is just an extension of white racism, shows up. Another important thing in that chapter with Mrs. Turner is the little conversations about Booker T. Washington. Mrs. Turner is very critical of Booker T. Washington. Janie has always been taught to admire him and that he was a great man and a great leader. But again, some black people thought that Booker T. Washington was sort of suggesting that black people should accept a second-class status. His focus was so much on just learn a trade, just take care of yourself economically. He didn't even suggest that people aspire to things like being doctors and lawyers. That's more what W.E.B. Du Bois argued for. Booker T. Washington was more focused on just respectability. And again, Janie had always been taught that Booker T. Washington was a great man and a great leader. Mrs. Turner is very critical of Booker T. Washington. So again, some of you might decide to do a little bit more, perhaps in a paper, a presentation, or something like that for a final project on the influence of Booker T. Washington and the contrast and tensions between someone like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So those were just a few of the real significant things that happened in this chunk. The next chunk of the book is the last chunk where the big climactic events happen, and I'll make one more short video about that section. And I hope some of you maybe decide to watch that film, a film version of this from 2005 that's available on YouTube. Notice they do leave out some important steps of the complexity of Janie and Tea Cake's relationship. They also leave out a couple of important steps in the very end of the novel, which I'll comment on in the next video. So I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you again soon.